Hello, this is Dr. Weislogel, and this is a brief presentation on Kantian moral philosophy to give you some of the key ideas that help you with your reading. This presentation should be viewed as a supplement to the written study guides that have been provided for you in Blackboard. So here's some key ideas. Now, I uploaded for you a separate presentation on the idea of imperatives, but just to review a little bit. An imperative for Kant is a formula of a command of reason, which is a conception of a necessitating objective principle. Now, only a Prussian philosophy professor could speak like that, so let's just make sure we know what we're talking about. A command of reason, that is an ought, a should, you must, that is incumbent upon your reason. As a rational being, you feel the force of this command. The imperative is a formula of that, a statement of that, an articulation of that command. And that command of reason is a concept, it's an idea that can be articulated in a formula of a necessitating objective principle. Necessitating is the kind of a force that moral principles exert. They come in the form of you should or you ought. Necessity, Kant distinguishes from necessitating as a different kind of a force. So the force of gravity, for instance, works by necessity. If we drop you off the side of a building, you will fall. But if I say you ought not to jump off the side of a building, that ought is a necessitating force. It's not guaranteeing you won't jump off the side of the building, but I think that you ought not to jump off the side of the building. So moral law comes with force, but it's a certain kind of a force that you could resist, but you could resist only on the pain of being irrational or immoral, as Kant would say. And it's an objective principle. It's a principle that holds whether or not anyone actually makes it their subjective principle. All right, what's the difference between subjective and objective? Anytime you have a motive, anytime you adopt a principle, that is your subjective principle or motive. Now, some subjective ideas are purely subjective. It's just a matter of you thinking them so. But a principle or a motive that someone ought to adopt, Kant calls an objective principle. It's a principle that you should adopt whether or not you actually do. In other words, whether or not you take that objective principle and make it your own subjective motive for your action. So again, you ought not to tell lies. That's an objective principle. That applies to you whether or not you decide to go ahead subjectively and tell lies or not. So an imperative is a formula of a command of reason, which is a conception of a necessitating objective principle. Well, that mouthful, what that means is the imperative it's incumbent upon you to follow that imperative, to follow that command of reason. Whether or not you actually do, well, that's up to you, and if you do or not, that will determine whether you're a moral person or not. Now, the other presentation takes this one graphic here, this chart, and talks about it at great length, so I'll just remind you that there are both categorical and hypothetical imperatives. Most of our life is operated upon the hypothetical imperatives. We have certain problems, we have certain issues, we want to do well, we want to accomplish things, we want to obtain things, and if we do want to attain those things, we have to do certain other things in order to get them. But we don't necessarily have to do all the things in life, and so those hypothetical imperatives don't always apply to everybody. The example from the other presentation is if you want to be an artist, then you ought to get some paints, but not everybody ought to be an artist. But moral principles apply categorically. They apply to all rational beings, and that includes me and you, no matter what other things that we want to do in life. So this moral imperatives are going to apply categorically. What's the category? The category of rational beings, me and you. There's some more key ideas. There's three types of propositions or truth according to Kant. This is one of the most famous aspects of Kant's philosophy. It's quite technical, but it's very important. He says there are three kinds of propositions or statements, or three kinds of truths. Analytic a priori truths. Analytic means true by definition. If you just understand the words in the sentence, you understand it's true. The a priori is Latin phrase that means before needing any actual experience. So if you see the sentence, all triangles have three sides, if you understand the definition of triangles and sides and three, then you understand that that statement is true. You don't need to go out and test triangles. Go out looking in the world for all the triangles to see if anything violates that proposition that all triangles have three sides. No, you know that triangles have three sides. They're true by definition. They're true by analysis of the words. They're true a priori, prior to any experience. And then there are synthetic a posteriori propositions. Again, these make perfect sense. They're synthetic in the sense that whatever is contained in the predicate of the sentence is not contained by definition in the subject of the sentence. So look at my example, all politicians are crooks. What it means to be a politician, be active in political life, is not the same as what it means to be a crook. Nevertheless, I could put those two ideas together, being a politician and being a crook or a criminal. I could put those, synthesize those two ideas, and then I have a claim. All politicians are crooks. But in order to know whether it's true, I can't just understand the definition of politician and understand the definition of crooks. I have to go out in the world and check. In fact, for this to be true, I have to check every politician. If there's one exception, then it's not true that all politicians are crooks. Maybe most of them are, or many of them are, or some of them are. But this claims that all politicians are crooks, and I'll never know if that's true unless I go out and examine all the politicians to see. That means this kind of truth is a posteriori. It comes after, posterior to, my examination of the world, to see the way the world is. So analytic statements being true a priori, synthetic statements are true if they are a posteriori. Some philosophers have debated these distinctions, but I think that the first two distinctions appeal to our common sense view of things. Some statements are true by definition, some statements are true depending on the way the world is. The first are analytic a priori statements, the second are synthetic a posteriori statements. Now what's controversial and what's added by Kant is a third category. It doesn't seem like they should go together. On the one hand, they're synthetic. A proposition that's synthetic means that what the meaning of the predicate is not contained in what the meaning of the subject of the sentence is. There's something put together or synthesized. But the a priori means you still don't have to do any exploration of the world. You don't have to go and check. They're true already. They're true by necessity. Now, how can that be? I can understand the a priori truth of an analytic proposition, like all triangles have three sides. I don't have to check triangles to know that's true. I just have to understand the words. And I can understand the a posteriori condition of synthetic propositions, like putting politicians and crooks together, or all bachelors are tall together. Being a bachelor and being tall don't mean the same thing. I have to see if they go together in that way. But what about a synthetic a priori statement? Well, Kant thought they were true without reference to experience, but they weren't true by definition. And he gives a couple of examples. Every event has a cause. The meaning of event is not the same as the meaning of cause. It's not, the cause is not contained in the meaning of event. Yet Kant would say, that statement's true, and you don't have to check. It doesn't depend on your experience. And more importantly for us is the second example. Rational beings are obliged to do their duty. Being obliged to do their duty is not contained in the definition of what it means to be a rational being, capable of conscious intellection. That's what rational being is. It's not contained in that definition, but Kant says, nevertheless, it's necessarily true. It's true a priori. If rational beings are obligated to do their duty, and you don't need to go out and check in the world. And that's the most controversial claim that comes from Kant's moral philosophy, that somehow morality is built in to the very structure of reason. That's where he's going with this. It's built into the structure of reason itself. So some more key ideas. The distinction between the moral law being autonomous and being heteronymous. You probably heard the word autonomy before, maybe not so familiar with heteronomy, but hetero just means different. in our word heterosexual, for instance. All right, hetero just means different, and the suffix nomy, nomi, that word comes from the Greek word nomos, which just means law. So heteronomy means the law, the moral law, comes to you from some source other than yourself. Autonomy means that the law comes to you from within yourself. Now let's go to the heteronymous idea first. What could be some sources of the law? Well, for instance, God could issue commandments, so the law that we're supposed to obey comes from God. Or the law could come from society only. It's the collectivity, it's the group, the social group that determines where the laws are, and the individual should obey those socially generated laws. Or it could be, and this might be a little weird to think about, maybe the law comes from your human nature, like natural laws we learned in Thomas Aquinas. Well, for Kant, that's still heteronymous. It doesn't come from you, it comes from evolution and the natural world, and the fact that as a biological being you get hungry and tired and so forth, and all those things somehow generate the shoulds, the oughts in your life. Kant rejects that. Kant thinks that the moral law must be autonomous. It must come from the self. Now, the self that he's talking about, it's very important to understand. He doesn't mean you or me in our individual personalities, our individual identities. The self he's talking about is our rational nature, not our human nature, not the nature that gets hungry and tired and needs to reproduce and wants to learn, not that nature. That nature, with all our appetites and desires, might lead us astray when it comes to morality. Because we get hungry, we might steal somebody else's food and justify it to ourselves by saying, well, we're hungry, we needed to eat, there was food. For Kant, the moral law applies universally regardless of our human biological circumstances, even our social circumstances. Morality is derived strictly from the rational nature that we have. That's what he was talking about when he says that it's a synthetic a priori truth that rational beings ought to do their duties, are obliged to do their duties. No one had to tell us that. God didn't tell us that. Society didn't tell us that. The written law didn't tell us that. Not even our human biological nature didn't tell us that. The only thing that tells us that is our rational nature in itself, and that's what Kant means by his claim that the moral law needs to be autonomous. It doesn't mean you just say and do whatever you personally feel like doing. It's whatever the reason that's within you tells you you ought to do. That's where the moral law comes from. So again, why can't the source of moral principles be heteronymous? Well, heteronymous principles can either be empirical, based on our happiness, or rational, based on perfection. He says if they're empirical, then they're based either on a physical feeling or a moral feeling, and if they were to be based on physical feelings, then that neglects the difference between well-being and well-doing. In other words, I'm hungry, I had my hunger satisfied, but that doesn't mean I satisfied it in the right way. If it's based on moral feelings, then moral is relative to different people's feelings and different cultural practices and traditions, and that gets rid of the universality of the moral law. So Kant says that can't be right. If it's rational, then it's based in either God's perfection, a theological idea of morality, or it's based on our own possible perfection, an ontological. Ontological means on the nature of being. If it's a theological basis, then he says that's impossible. We don't know. We can't intuit or experience God, and are instead deriving God's qualities from our own favored qualities. In other words, we project, according to Kant, out into the world the way God probably is based on what we think our good qualities are. And by the way, he says, I don't think we want all of God's qualities. For instance, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. Well, maybe vengeance isn't really a good part of morality. If it's based on an ontology, then Kant wants to say, well, that makes it empty or indefinite or useless. It's circular. Our perfection presupposes our morality, and our morality presupposes that we understand what perfection is, and our perfection presupposes our morality, and morality perfection. We get into a big circle like that, and we never really get to understand the source of moral principles. The moral law, says Kant, to summarize, is a formula of a categorical imperative that's imperative, that has its necessitating force on anything belonging to the category rational, and that's you and me. It's a synthetic a priori truth. It's not built into the definition of rationality. Nevertheless, it's necessarily true with, in fact, apodictic or unquestionable certainty, and that moral law has to come to us autonomously, not by our own human nature, but by our own, the structure of reason, the structure of rationality that's within us. So obeying the moral law, we said in a categorical imperative, is a formula of the moral law. Okay, well, here are some formulas. In a generic form, it's do your duty, whatever your duty may be, and for the sake of duty. In other words, if you do your duty because you're, today getting very close to tax day in the United States, if you do your duty and pay your taxes because you're afraid of going to jail if you don't, well, the act that you perform accords with duty, but you're not doing it for duty's sake, and that therefore you're not behaving morally. A moral action is doing your duty because it's your duty and for no other reason, not for fear or not for the sake of gain or popularity or anything of the sort. There are further formulations of this categorical imperative. The formula of universality. Act in such a way that your maxim or your reason for acting could be willed to be a universal law. And it puts in parentheses of nature, in the sense that you would want to test your motives for acting by asking, what if everyone did it? What if everyone did it this way? What if I had the power to will that this motive would become a law of nature like gravity, which people don't have an option of obeying? They must obey. They automatically obey, not by necessitation, but by necessity. They have to obey the law of gravity. What if I said to lie to get out of a promise would be an automatic law like gravity, so that anytime anybody opened their mouth to make a promise, they would automatically be lying to get out of that promise in the long run? Well, Kant just says, well, what would happen to the possibility of making promises? In fact, what would happen to the possibility of even communicating? The answer is it would be destroyed. No one could communicate or make a promise if it was guaranteed that the other person and you yourself would be lying at every moment. May I borrow $100 from you? I'll pay it back, I promise. Well, if I automatically hear that as a lie, there's no possibility of your making that promise to me. And of course, if I say, yeah, I'll give you the money tomorrow, if that were automatically a lie, you can expect that that money wasn't going to ever show up. And so if people lie, if they ask themselves, well, what if everybody lied all the time automatically? How would the world be? Kant says it would break down rationality altogether. So one way to test whether what you're doing is moral is to ask yourself, well, what if I could will that to be a universal law? Another formulation is called the formula of the end in itself. Act in such a way that you always treat humanity, and by this, again, he means rational nature, whether in your own person or in the person of another, never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end in itself. Now, what Kant's talking about there is a couple things. First, notice you have obligations to yourself as well as to other people. You can act in such a way that violates your own central nature as a rational being, and that's morally wrong. And you can certainly treat other people that way, and that's morally wrong. And what does it mean to treat somebody never simply as a means, but always as an end in itself? Well, we learned with Aristotle about the final causes. Our final cause, according to Aristotle, is happiness. Well, our final cause, if Kant were to talk that way, is to be rational beings. That is what we are. And we have to remember that all people, as rational beings, are worthy of our respect. They have a certain dignity, almost sacredness, according to Kant. And we should never just treat them as a means. We should never treat other human beings just as tools for our own desires. For instance, if I run a business, now certainly I'm going to treat other human beings as means to running that business. I can't run the business all by myself. I need other people as a means to be able to successfully run the business. But if I treated those people only as means, only as tools or instruments of my running the business, Kant said I would be treating them immorally. I have to remember that they're human persons that are working for me, that are like myself, rational beings worthy of all dignity and respect. So one way to find out if I'm acting morally is I treat people with the dignity and respect that they deserve as being rational beings like myself. It doesn't say don't treat people as means, because that's impossible. You treat me as a means to getting a little bit more education. I might treat you as a means of making a little income, but we can't treat each other only as means to be treating each other morally. Another formula is the formula of autonomy. Act in such a way, that should say, excuse the typo, act in such a way that your will can regard itself at the same time as making universal law through its maxims. This is this same sense of autonomy. You act thinking, I am making a world through every act and choice in my life. I'm determining something about myself, but I'm determining something about the way the world is, as if I'm a lawgiver myself. And then finally, the last one, formula of the kingdom of ends, is, well, act in such a way as you were through your maxim, a law-making member of a kingdom of ends. Well, what's a kingdom? Well, that's a world. And what are the ends? In this case, the ends, he means what's most important. What's the highest thing? And for Kant, it's you and me as rational beings. We have to act in such a way that we were making a world together, for myself, from ourselves, with no one telling us how to do it, but just looking within to the rational nature that we all share and determining from that what's the best way for us to be. That's another formula of this moral law, this categorical imperative that we should always obey. So the form of the law, the shape of the law, any law to be a moral law has to apply universally. So universality is the form of the law. And what's the matter of the law, the content of the law, the subject of the law? That's the end in itself. In other words, that's rational nature. If a proposed law for acting does not apply universally, it's not a moral law. If a proposed law for acting does not take as its goal the perfection of rational nature, and instead as a goal of, say, happiness or pleasure or comfort or ease, whatever you have there according to Kant, is not a moral law. The purpose of reason. Kant says, he asks early in his text, why do we have reason? Is it for our happiness? And he says something kind of funny in his text there. He says, well, reason, it's not always helping me get happiness, and sometimes it gets in the way of my happiness. In other words, I see a very attractive person, and I think, wow, I'd like to get together with that person and be with them and, get it on, as they say. Well, that's all well and good until my reason wakes up and says, hey, Eric, you're a married man. You love your wife. Your wife loves you. You have children. You've made a life with these other people. You can't just go running around doing whatever you want every time you see an attractive other person. My reason gets in the way. Or a simple thing, I like a hot fudge sundae. Can't wait to dig into a hot fudge sundae, but then my reason jumps up and says, you're putting on a little weight there, son. You better not eat all the hot fudge sundaes just because they look attractive to you. So Kant says reason can't be just for our happiness. Now, I should quickly say that Kant does not think of happiness in the same way as Aristotle does. Aristotle, remember, said happiness is the fulfillment, the completion, the full maturity of what it means to be a human person. It doesn't just mean pleasure. And for Kant, I think he thinks happiness is equivalent to pleasure. Notice me. I'm attracted to another person that I'm not married to, or I want to dig into an extra hot fudge sundae. Kant would call those things pursuing happiness. Aristotle would say, well, it's pursuing pleasure, but it may not have anything to do with my ultimate happiness. So we have to understand when Kant says that reason is not for the sake of happiness, that it can get in the way of happiness. Well, that's definitely true if by happiness you just mean pleasure. So Kant says, no, the purpose of reason is not to attain your happiness. The purpose is to have a good will. Right? Now, what does that mean? Well, the will is the ability to act in accordance with a conception of law. It's practical reason. It's one who understands one of those formulas of the imperative and can say, I will act with that as my motive. I will make that my principle. A good will is making the objective maxim your subjective maxim. And that's what we said earlier. The objective maxim is what you ought to do. The subjective maxim is the motive that you actually have to do what you do. So if you have a good will, you've taken that objective maxim, for instance, always treating people never simply as means, but always as ends in themselves, and you make that your actual motive for how you treat other people. The objective is what you should do. The subjective is what you do. And if you do the right thing, you do follow the objective moral law, you have a good will. And Kant says the only good in itself is the good will. It's an end in itself. It's not for the sake of anything else. You have a good will not to get happy, not to get rich, not to get famous, but to be morally good. It's a good in itself. And as the only good in itself, Kant is able to say it's not a matter of whether you're happy, it's a matter of whether you deserve to be happy. In other words, did you attain your happiness by acting with a good will, by obeying the moral law, or did you get your happiness, which again he thinks is pleasure, by just doing whatever you felt like doing? So the only ultimate good is not your happiness, at least as he understands it as pleasure. The ultimate good is having a good will. So to have a good will is to act in accordance with the categorical imperative. Having a good will is the criterion for one's worthiness to be happy, and to have a good will is to do your duty for duty's sake. Another point we need to make is Kant's understanding of duties to ourselves and duties to others, and by what he means by perfect and imperfect duties. So perfect duties admit of no exceptions or variations. They're usually formulated with a negative. So you could see you have a perfect duty to yourself not to commit suicide. Now you could phrase that as preserve your life, but do not commit suicide. And there's no exceptions to that. You can't say I've preserved my life every day except one, because then you didn't preserve your life. The duties to other: do not commit murder. In order to obey that duty, to keep that duty, you can't say, well, I didn't murder anybody today except one person. Nope, you did not satisfy that duty. There's no exceptions. But imperfect duties admit of variations or diversity of expressions. So for instance, taking an imperfect duty to others, you have a duty to help other people in life. If you never helped another person, Kant would say you can't possibly have been a moral person. All right, so you choose to do your duty to help others. But which others? The people in your neighborhood, the people who were victims of the tsunami in Japan, the people who are still struggling after Katrina all these years down in New Orleans. I mean, which others are you going to help them, and how are you going to help them? Are you going to send them money? Are you going to go volunteer your time? Are you going to help to build buildings? How are you going to do it? Well, there's lots of variations and the diversity of expressions of that help, but the point is to help. So that's the difference then between perfect and imperfect duties and duties to yourself and to others. It is the motive or maxim for acting that conveys moral worth. It is not immediate inclination, because you just like to build houses. It's not self-interest. I'll help them by building houses because that'll make me rich. But duty alone that makes your actions morally worthy. So it's not just acting in accordance with duty, but acting for the sake of duty that forms the good will. So I think for discussion along the way, perhaps in the forum is, well, what are the practical applications of Kant's views about our autonomous moral law? What are some possible weaknesses in his theory? And maybe some more detailed comparisons with Aristotle's virtue ethics. What ideas seem to be the same between Kant and Aristotle, and where do they differ? Well, anyway, I hope this little presentation has helped you a little bit with understanding some of the key ideas of Kant's moral philosophy. And again, it's meant to be used in conjunction with the written study guides that are available via Blackboard.